So our second speaker is Lamis Deek. Lamis is a Palestinian-born, New York-based human rights attorney, advocate, and strategist whose practice has handled criminal and civil, domestic and international matters, from transaction to trial and appeals. She's litigated Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim civil rights and criminal issues ranging from free speech and free worship to state repression and manufactured terrorism cases. Internationally, she devises crisis response, political and legal strategy and consultancy, and handles cross-jurisdictional matters related to national security, anti-corruption, human rights, and commerce. Lamis has handled some of the most widely covered terrorism cases. She was key in decoding the illegal demographics unit and successfully defended countless targets of that unit. She defeated key players of the anti-mosque movement and protected mosque construction in court and through mobilizations. She has defended countless students and protesters against false arrest, predatory prosecution, illegal surveillance, and from Israeli lawfare, and has also represented Black, Latino, and East Asian activists. She's the advisor to various national and international organizations, movements, and actors. Aside from legal work, Lamis has been an advocate and organizer for socioeconomic and political rights for oppressed communities with a focus on Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities domestically and internationally. Some of her notable work includes her co-organizing of the 2003 Iraq anti-war rally, co-organizing the US arm of the 2009 Viva Palestina medicine convoy to Gaza, crafting global legal and civil society strategies for victims of high-profile Israeli raids and murder victims. She helped to secure the release of some of the first Egyptian Arab Spring activists and is devising and co-leading several international initiatives related to Palestine and the region. Lamis's work has been presented at several international and expert strategy meetings. Lamis?
Hi, thanks, Carrie. That was a really long introduction. I thought it would have been cut down, so my apologies to everybody. I'm going to have a more informal kind of presentation. I'm going to start by just touching briefly on some historic aspects of Palestine. Just, anybody could easily access this, but just to give it some framing and to add some points that people might be a bit less familiar with. I'm sure everybody here and listening in understands that Israel was formed as an extension of British colonization of Palestine during and via what came to be known as the Balfour Declaration of the early 1900s. And so the British colonizers passed on the reins of their colonization of Palestine to European Zionist organizers, and after a series of massacres, rapes, murders of entire families, including public lynchings as a terror tactic to cause the flight of Palestinians, along with the encampment of Palestinians in essentially slave labor camps, which are not covered and little addressed and often not known, followed by massive exile. 2/3 of the Palestinian population turned refugees, who now remain the oldest and the largest refugee population in the world, at which point the Zionists went in and they robbed the homes and conducted a series of home invasions and land corruption and literally moved into the homes of the Palestinians that they'd killed or exiled. And I think that this history is important to helping inform the danger which Zionist exceptionalism and Israeli exceptionalism poses to people all over the world, ideologically and materially, but really ideologically, especially when we're talking to lawyers, of how that plays out, and how when we're looking at various interpretations or applications of either domestic law, terrorism law, free speech issues, or even international law, what we're really talking about. And I think that that's important, and it also helps inform what Palestinians demand, especially in this kind of renewed stage of the Palestinian liberation struggle. The current developments, I don't know if many know, so I'm going to touch upon this briefly because it also informs what I might bring in as suggestions for what we could do as activist attorneys. We saw in the past year, I think it's coming up on a year now, the legislation of what came to be the Israeli nation-state law. And the nation-state law was a codification of racism, of Israeli apartheid. And it basically said that the right to self-determination was preserved solely for the Jewish population, the vast majority of which are not native to Palestine. We saw the move of the embassy from Jerusalem, which Biden has confirmed he was not going to move out of Jerusalem again. And then we had, on top of this, the announcement of the Israeli annexation plan, which Israel actually has been announcing for decades now, right? The idea of Eretz Israel and the annexation is not new, but all of this does two things of which I think we have to be aware. Number one, of course, now it is not just policy, but express, bold, unapologetic law that apartheid is apartheid and ethnic, racial, religious supremacy is the actual veritable law of Israeli land, number one. And number two, we have an announcement of the increased pace of the incremental genocide of Palestinians. Now, Palestine is one of the longest colonized places on earth because Palestine, irrelevant for us as well, sits at what is considered to be one of the most geomilitarily strategic points on earth, in that it sits right at the cross points between the African continent, the south of Europe, West Asia. It's easy access to East Asia. And so historically, it's always been colonized. What is different with the Israeli colonization and occupation is that this time it is not just a colonization and an apartheid for the purpose of exploitation and subjugation to create a subclass, but rather what's new about this is it's a genocide for the purpose of replacement. It's apartheid for the purpose of replacement. And I think all of this is important to understand as we navigate and understand how that affects us and why this is so critical to the US ruling class and US imperialism. And it relies on Israel and Zionism and Israeli colonization and expansion, relies on the very same ideological and material forces that mobilize and give life to racism, anti-Black racism in the US and globally. Ideologically, Zionism in Israel requires a constant choice. And we've seen this play out with very many Black organizations in the US specifically, right? It chooses that we are either, as a movement, as a people, as a nation, as a global morality, that we are anti-racist, or we make exceptions for racism, right? And this choice then informs the response by forces of Zionism who are in power as to how they respond to us. In its inception also, and as it exists today, Israel is also a white supremacist project, right? When the British passed on the reins of power and passed on the guns, they certainly didn't pass it on to African and Arab Jewish people who were coming, but rather to the Europeans that were coming. And this white supremacist kind of we only trust the white Zionists to be the colonial outpost, right, as they had promised they would be to the British, manifests itself daily. We've seen the anti-Black and anti-African rallies, but there's also a whole institutionalized graded system based on color in the 48 areas known as quote unquote Israel, right? Where pay grades are based on your skin color, right? What areas you're allowed to access are based on your skin color, not just whether you're a Palestinian or not, but whether you're a white, brown, or Black Israeli. And so we still have this very graded society. And at the bottom of the graded society is the Palestinians, but is also all of those who exist in dissent to Israeli and Zionist supremacy and colonialism, right? And Israel is one of the most, if not the most, militarized societies on earth. And Israel plays a very critical role in global militarization and the global military industrial complex. And what this means when they say, or when we know, when we can map out, right, very clearly that to Israel and to Zionist organizations and institutions in power, dissent is the biggest threat, this also means that the circumference of Israeli violence, the circumference of this militarized society, expands to all chambers and niches of dissent to Israeli apartheid, colonization, and genocide. And we saw this ideologically in the way it's affected the ability and the rights of people to have free speech in the US, whether it's on campuses or off campuses in places of employment, who's able to keep their employment, the treatment of the media by people who speak up against Israeli colonization, Israeli racism, and apartheid, right? And so we constantly see this expanding mobilization of apparatus of violence, censorship, and surveillance for all those who dissent. And in the US, the loudest and most prominent voices of dissent have always been, of course, Black voices who stood in solidarity, because we share this ideological threat, right? Because if we can normalize and exceptionalize a graded society, a society that's structured specifically around ethnicity and race, right, as a norm. If we make an exception for apartheid to exist in Palestine, well, then this is a direct ideological threat to us in the US and globally across the world. So the Black community in the US has been very vocal and most unapologetic, and some of the first of US society to come out vocally, and therefore some of the first of American non-Arab, non-Muslim society to bear the brunt of that Zionist Israeli violence, criminalization, demonization, all of that as part and parcel. And we saw this recently with Mark Lamont Hill. We saw this historically with the criminalization of SNCC. At some point, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, had said that they had managed to win tons of support, but within 3 months of speaking out against Israel and Zionism, their organization was liquidated. And we see this again, even in the post 9/11 area, and I'll get to that in a second. So it can almost be said that the role of Zionism and the Israeli circumference of violence and militarized surveillance and demonization, in collaboration with the media that develops this rhetoric, in collaboration with educational institutions and their funders, which police the narrative and what kind of education you can receive about this, have also played a role in determining what are the acceptable forms of self-determination for the Black liberation movement and for Black communities. And this can actually also be mapped out when we see the defunding and the destruction of groups like SNCC or Movement for Black Lives when they put out a statement, or the Hunter groups. There are many groups in New York and small groups that people don't know about that were doing Black liberation work and then spoke on Palestine and then were effectively liquidated directly, ideologically, and materially by funding, and then also by surveillance. And so this is the policing and the narrowing of you can work for Black liberation on the condition that you make an exception for racism, that you make an exception for apartheid, and that you allow the structured society, which will always threaten you by precedent and materially by its apparatus. Materially, again, Israel is one of the most militarized, if not the most militarized society on earth. And the way that it continues to expand this militarization is by the creation of this false threat. And the false threat is specifically and explicitly based on racial religious lines, right? Palestinian, Muslim, Arab in the 1970s, Muslim or Christian, so long as you are Arab, and those who identify are the threat against which it has to constantly defend itself and produce and advance its technology, which this militarization becomes a key source of diplomacy and survival and normalization within the region. And then we can look at Sudan and South Sudan, for example, right? So recent reports just last year, which we've known since the 1950s, Israel has been operating in South Sudan, fomenting divisions to support, to build a cadre of ideological and military support for its apartheid and colonization in the region. And one of the reports revealed that it was creating problems that only it could solve by exporting its own surveillance and military technology. And it's one of the most militarily advanced, technologically advanced forces in the world. So we saw this in Sudan when I think Suzanne Adeli is on this call, when we met with Togo, when they were trying to build this Israel-Africa summit in, no sense of irony whatsoever. When we asked the Togo government representatives, we said, what is in this for you? And the first thing that they said was the military equipment. So this militarization becomes a key to its diplomacy. It's not just a matter of situating itself as a colonial outpost, as one of the most important military bases, right? Because Biden said if there wasn't an Israel in Palestine, we would have had to create one. That's unfortunately the truth. So Israel plays a critical cog, and then it also and has a reciprocal import-export relationship in military and surveillance technology with the U.S. And we see this with G4S, right? The prison and the wall building companies. We see this with, I'm sorry, let me look to my notes. There's so many, I wanted to pick out a few. The terrorism framework, right? We saw this with COINTELPRO and the demographics, right? The demographics unit was the modern version or current version, post 9/11 version of COINTELPRO, and the demographics unit was this illegal operation that was developed by the CIA, the NYPD, and the Israeli occupation forces in the West Bank and Gaza to develop surveillance projects that did not only target Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians in the tri-state area and probably elsewhere, but also targeted Black activists, our allies right here in New York and in the tri-state area, for surveillance, for criminalization, for entrapment, all, of course, completely illegally. But the idea that the circumference of violence had extended so far to dissent that not only is your typical run-of-the-mill surveillance there, but you have a surveillance network that is modeled directly upon a military occupation force that has a full control of Palestinian society. I mean, this is a real direct threat and shows us how our struggles are very much materially joined, right? It's the same politicians and it's the same corporations. And when we say politicians and corporations, there really isn't much space left to even see any difference in the forces of oppression, which we both struggle against. And to that end, it could be said that Palestinians are able to resist this sort of exploitation and criminalization, this sort of repression and suppression in a way that folks in the US can't. And it can be said that in their physical resistance, Palestinians are really on the front line of tackling the military-industrial complex and of tackling the globalized militarization, right? We also saw, of course, the training of the police forces, and you can couch that into the demographics. So the liberation of Palestinians really plays a direct role in disempowering and weakening one of the most crucial bases, military outposts of corporations that are exploiting and subjugating and fomenting graded and racist and violent societies. A very critical role. And so for this reason, of course, Black allies historically dating probably since the 50s in the US have always seen, just as Palestinians have seen, the reciprocity in our struggles and the relationships and how each struggle informs the other and empowers the other. And we don't just need to look at, the historic examples we hear often about Malcolm X, Allah yarhamu, who did a great service in bringing Palestine and Zionism to the forefront in of discussion and political thought in the US, but also to contemporaries, right? The Black Panthers coming out of jail now, Daruba bin Wahad, who was kept out of Palestine because he was known to be a Black Panther in solidarity and rights often. We see it, Mark Lamont Hill, Danny Glover, right? We see it in the relationships, which have been quite intimate. I mean, folks in New York who've been doing this work alongside us for a long time can tell you we had these beautiful coalitions, RJ 9/11, where we had a Malcolm X grassroots movement along with Palestinian groups. And there was these intimate relationships where we were on the streets for each other and we were in the courts for each other, and we can predict who was gonna face what. And we were constantly, as we were grappling with post 9/11 issues in the US, I was always reaching out to Black elders and Black liberation activists to learn what to expect. And there was this constant reciprocity and empowerment of each other and each other's work, and therefore of each other's community. So it's not long, it's not purely ideological, and it's not some romantic, but a real material and needed active, living, constantly renewed solidarity. And we saw this, you know, Palestinians outside the US can play solidarity, you know, can be in solidarity only so much, right, in terms of protest. And then come Ferguson 2014, we had Palestinians who are on the front lines again of the advancement and experimentation of technologies of suppression, which are reciprocated between the US and Israel, telling people how to survive, how to deal with drones, how to deal with tear gas, right? On the front lines, kind of themselves experimenting with resistance and then exporting resistance, exporting mechanisms of survival, even now exporting agricultural mechanisms and lessons of survival under really repressive and difficult conditions. So it's quite firm, quite direct, implicates all of us. And the stage that we're at now, yes, everybody's familiar with BDS. That really is the very least that we can say, because BDS essentially says Palestinians are human beings who shouldn't be killed. What we really need now, in the face of the announcement of and the plans, the ongoing increased genocide of Palestinians, really, is we need to bring back the right of Palestinians to defend themselves into the mainstream. And there's a role for lawyers to play in this, for the judiciary to play in this, right? In terms of analyses and development of space and rhetoric and legal arguments and legal space, and creating new arguments and legal space so that we can end the criminalization of Palestinians and their right to self-defense. Just a note, as people might know, just like with the Black liberation and Black defense activists, the vast majority of Palestinian political parties are deemed to be terrorist organizations, right? And this is a very disabling, disempowering, and liquidating label to give people. We saw this label being imposed on Assata Shakur post 9/11 as well, if you'll recall, with the bounty being placed on her head. And so all of this really needs to be challenged rhetorically and brought into the mainstream for the sake of Palestinians, for the sake of regional peace, for the sake of ending economies that really just almost solely rely on war and racism and violence, and for our own sake to be able to put up stronger challenges against weaker foes in the military industrial complex and the corporations and the politicians that benefit from that.